cruel hunters group laughed at the obese girl. The mountain man stood up and made them flee. The autumn of 1816 brought an early frost to the settlement of Cedar Ridge, a scattered collection of log cabins and trading posts nestled in the shadow of the Appalachian foothills. It was a place where survival depended on strength, where the weak were forgotten, and where mercy was as rare as gold in the mountain streams. Mary Ann Fletcher had known this truth her entire 17 years. She had been born large, a fact her mother attributed to too much cornbread during pregnancy, and had only grown larger as the years passed. By the time she reached womanhood, her body had become a source of constant commentary, whispered mockery, and outright cruelty from those who considered themselves her betters. Her father, a trapper who had died when she was 12, had always told her that size didn't matter in the wilderness. "Out here, Mary Ann," he'd said, his weathered hand on her shoulder, "what counts is your heart and your will to survive." But her father was gone now, buried beneath a simple wooden cross on the hill above the settlement, and without his protection, Mary Ann had learned that society judged by different standards. She lived with her aging mother in a cabin at the edge of Cedar Ridge, taking in mending and washing to earn their keep. Most days, she kept her head down, spoke only when necessary, and tried to make herself as invisible as a girl of her considerable size could manage. But every few weeks, she had no choice but to venture into the settlement proper, to the trading post, where supplies could be purchased with the meager coins they'd saved. It was on one such afternoon, with the October sun casting long shadows across the muddy main street, that Mary Ann's world changed forever. They called themselves the Ridge Hunters, a name that sounded far more noble than the reality warranted. The group consisted of 5 men, rough frontiersmen who had drifted into Cedar Ridge the previous spring with promises of clearing the land of predators and making the settlement safe for decent folk. What they'd actually done was hunt just enough to justify their presence while spending most of their time drinking rot-gut whiskey, gambling away their earnings, and terrorizing anyone they perceived as weak. Their leader was a man named Silas Gretsch, tall and lean, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held no warmth. His companions' brothers named Jim and Tobias Keller, a former soldier called Pike, and a youngster barely out of his teens known only as Red, followed Silas's lead in all things, including his particular brand of cruel entertainment. Mary Ann had crossed paths with them before. They'd made comments as she passed, laughed at her from across the street, once even blocked her path just to watch her stammer and retreat. But today, as she emerged from the trading post with her basket of supplies, a small sack of flour, some dried beans, a precious tin of salt, they seemed to be in an especially vicious mood. "Well, well," Silas drawled, pushing off from the post where he'd been leaning. "Look what we have here, boys. The mountain herself has come down to visit us common folk." Mary Ann's heart began to pound. She clutched her basket tighter and tried to move around them, but Tobias stepped into her path, grinning to show teeth stained brown from tobacco. "Where you going in such a hurry?" Tobias asked. "We was just about to say how nice you look today." The others laughed harsh, mocking sounds that drew attention from the dozen or so people on the street. Mary Ann saw Mrs. Henderson pause at the door of her husband's smithy. She saw old Mr. Pritchard stop mid-stride, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment before he looked away and continued walking. She saw Sarah Cooper, a girl her own age, whisper something to her companion and then turn her back entirely. No one would help her. They never did. "Please," Mary Ann said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own thundering heartbeat. "Let me pass." "Let you pass?" Silas repeated, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Why, we wouldn't dream of stopping you, would we, boys? But first, maybe you could help us settle a bet." He moved closer, and Mary Ann could smell the whiskey on his breath. Her hands trembled, making the basket shake. "See, we've been arguing about just how much a girl like you must eat in a day," Silas continued. "I say it must be enough to feed 3 men. Jim here thinks it's more like 4. What do you say?" The laughter came again, louder this time. Mary Ann felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of them. I need to go home," she managed. "Home to eat some more, I reckon," Red chimed in, emboldened by the other's laughter. "Wonder your poor mama can afford to keep you fed." That's when Silas reached out and snatched the basket from her hands. Mary Ann gasped and reached for it, but Pike grabbed her arm, holding her back, while Silas rummaged through her supplies. "Look at this," Silas said, pulling out the small sack of flour. "Barely enough for a week of biscuits for a normal person. This wouldn't last you 3 days, would it, girl?" Before Mary Ann could respond, before she could even process what was happening, Silas upended the sack. White flour cascaded out, mixing with the mud in the street, ruined beyond salvaging. The flour her mother had saved for 2 months to buy. The flour that was supposed to see them through the coming winter. "Oops," Silas said, his voice devoid of genuine regret. "Clumsy of me." Something broke inside Mary Ann then. Not anger. She'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. What broke was the last fragment of hope she'd been carrying, the small voice that had whispered that maybe, someday, things might be different. Maybe someday someone would see her as something other than a target for mockery. She sank to her knees in the mud, desperately trying to scoop up the flour, knowing even as she did that it was hopeless. The beans had fallen too, scattering across the street. The salt tin had rolled into a puddle. Everything was ruined. "Ain't that the saddest thing you ever saw?" Jim said, nudging his brother, "like a sow rootin' in the mud." The tears came then, hot and shameful, streaming down Mary Ann's face as she knelt in the dirt surrounded by her ruined supplies. Through her blurred vision, she saw the people of Cedar Ridge watching. Mrs. Henderson had her hand over her mouth, but made no move to intervene. Mr. Pritchard had stopped again, but stood frozen, clearly unwilling to confront the Ridge Hunters. Even Reverend Thomas, who preached about Christian charity every Sunday, merely shook his head and turned away. "Ain't nobody in these parts ever going to stand up for you, girl," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly down the street. "Best you'd learn that now and save yourself some heartache later. You're alone in this world, and you always will be." Mary Ann's sob caught in her throat, a sound of such profound brokenness that it seemed to echo off the wooden buildings surrounding them. It was the sound of a spirit giving up, of hope dying, of a young woman accepting that this was all life would ever offer her: humiliation, loneliness, and the crushing weight of other people's cruelty. And then, cutting through that terrible moment like a knife through canvas, came a voice. "Pick it up." Everyone turned. The Ridge Hunter's smirks faltered. Mary Ann looked up through her tears, At the edge of the trading post's wooden porch stood a man who seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. He was massive, not fat like people called Mary Ann, but built like an ancient oak, all hard muscle and weathered strength. His hair was dark and long, pulled back with a leather cord. His face was bronzed by sun and wind, marked with scars that spoke of a life lived hard and survived against odds. He wore buckskin pants and a heavy shirt, with a long knife at his belt and a rifle leaning against the wall beside where he'd been sitting. This was the man they called the Mountain Man, though few knew his given name. He'd appeared in Cedar Ridge about a month ago, coming down from the high country with a load of furs to trade. He'd taken a room above the trading post and had been seen most days sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife, checking his traps, doing the quiet work of a solitary man. He spoke to no one, bothered no one, and seemed content to be left alone. Until now. "I said," the mountain man repeated, his voice low and steady as distant thunder, "pick it up." Silas recovered his composure first, puffing out his chest. "This ain't your concern, mister. We're just having a bit of fun with the girl." The mountain man rose to his feet. Standing, he seemed even larger, towering over the porch rail, his eyes gray as winter storm clouds fixed on Silas with an intensity that made the hunter take an involuntary step backward. "Pick it up," the mountain man said again, each word deliberate and weighted with unmistakable threat. "Like hell I will," Silas blustered, but his voice had lost its swagger. "You don't give me orders, old man." The mountain man said nothing. He simply walked down the 3 steps from the porch, his boots heavy on the wood, each footfall deliberate. He crossed the distance to where they stood in measured strides, and with each step the ridge hunters seemed to shrink a little more. When he reached the group, he stopped. He was close enough now that Mary Ann could see the details of his face, the hard line of his jaw, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the absolute absence of fear or doubt in his expression. He looked at each of the ridge hunters in turn, and one by one they looked away. "You got a choice here," the mountain man said quietly. "You can pick up what you spilled, apologize to this young woman, and walk away. Or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached behind his back and drew a tomahawk from his belt, a weapon that looked ancient and deadly in equal measure. With a casual motion that spoke of long practice, he turned and slammed it into the wooden post beside Silas's head, burying the blade deep into the timber with a sharp crack that echoed down the entire main street. The sound seemed to freeze time itself. Birds stopped singing. The wind stopped blowing. Every person on the street stood motionless, staring at the tomahawk still quivering in the post, mere inches from where Silas's head had been a moment before. "Or," the mountain man continued in that same quiet, terrible voice, "we can do this another way." For a long moment no one moved. Then Jim whispered, "He's crazy. Silas, he's out of his mind." "I've killed men for less than what you just did," the mountain man said, his eyes never leaving Silas's face. "Killed them and slept sound that night. You think I won't do the same to you?" That broke the spell. Red was the first to move, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Pike followed, muttering something about not wanting trouble. The Keller brothers exchanged a glance and began to edge away. Only Silas remained, his pride warring with his survival instinct. But when the mountain man took one more step forward, bringing them nearly chest to chest, Silas's nerve finally broke. "This ain't over," Silas snarled, but he was already moving, backing away while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "You made an enemy today, old man." "Get in line," the mountain man said flatly. The ridge hunters retreated, their swagger replaced by hurried, awkward movements. They practically tripped over each other in their haste to put distance between themselves and the man who just humiliated them. Within seconds, they disappeared around the corner of the general store, their voices carrying back in angry but distant mutters. The mountain man watched them go, his posture relaxed but ready, like a wolf that knows the deer have fled but remains alert for their return. Only when they were completely out of sight did he turn his attention to Mary Ann, still kneeling in the mud. His expression softened not much, but enough that Mary Ann could see he was no longer the terrifying force that had confronted the hunters. He knelt beside her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he began gathering the scattered beans and placing them in her basket. "The flour's ruined," he said quietly, "but we can save the rest." You didn't—" Mary Ann's voice failed her. She couldn't find words adequate to what had just happened, to what this stranger had just done. "Don't talk," the mountain man said. "Just breathe. Take your time." They worked in silence for a few minutes, gathering what could be saved. Mary Ann was acutely aware of the people watching from doorways and windows, aware of the whispers that had already started, but for once the attention felt different. They weren't looking at her with contempt or pity. They were looking at the mountain man with fear, and at her with something that might have been respect. When everything salvageable had been collected, the mountain man stood and offered his hand to help Mary Ann to her feet. She hesitated. Years of rejection had taught her to be wary of offered kindness, but something in his steady gaze made her take his hand. His grip was strong but careful, and he lifted her from the mud as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "Thank you," Mary Ann whispered, finally finding her voice. I can't." "No need for thanks," the mountain man said. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out several coins, pressing them into her hand. "Get more flour. Get whatever else you need. Consider it payment." "Payment for what?" Mary Ann asked, confused. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth, though it held more sadness than joy. "For reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are poor." He picked up his rifle from the porch and turned to go, clearly considering the matter settled. But Mary Ann, emboldened by his kindness or perhaps by the realization that her life had just fundamentally changed, called after him, "Wait, I don't even know your name." He paused, his back to her, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without turning, he said, Elijah Crane." "I'm Mary Ann Fletcher," she said, though he hadn't asked. This time he did turn, and his gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "I know who you are, Mary Ann Fletcher. I've seen you around the settlement. You help your mother. You're kind to the children. You don't gossip or spread malice." He paused. "In my experience, that makes you worth 10 of most folk in this town." Before Mary Ann could respond, before she could process this unexpected compliment, Elijah Crane walked away, disappearing around the side of the trading post and leaving her standing in the street with her rescued supplies, a handful of coins, and a feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite name. That evening, as Mary Ann helped her mother prepare their meager supper, She recounted the day's events. Her mother, Margaret Fletcher, listened with increasing alarm, her weathered hands pausing in their work of stirring the pot of beans. "The mountain man?" her mother repeated. "Mary Ann, you must stay away from him. People say he's dangerous." "He helped me, Mama," Mary Ann protested. "When no one else would, he stood up for me." "And I'm grateful for that," her mother said carefully. "But men like that, they're not civilized, Mary Ann. He lives alone in the mountains. He doesn't go to church. Why, I've heard he once killed 3 men in a single fight. Maybe they deserved it," Mary Ann said quietly. Her mother's expression softened. She set down her spoon and took Mary Ann's hands in her own. "I know how hard it's been for you, sweetheart. I know people can be cruel, but you can't go pinning your hopes on a man like that. He's not going to stay. Men like him never do." Mary Ann wanted to argue, wanted to defend Elijah Crane, but she couldn't find the words, because part of her feared her mother was right. Why would a man like that care about a girl like her beyond a momentary impulse of kindness? Tomorrow, he'd probably forget she existed. Except that's not what happened. The next morning, when Mary Ann emerged from her cabin to fetch water from the well, she found a deer carcass hanging from a tree branch near their door, already field-dressed and ready to be butchered. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but Mary Ann knew. The cut was too clean, too professional to be anyone but an experienced hunter. 3 days later, she found a stack of firewood neatly split and stacked beside their cabin, enough to last them a month. Again, no note, no request for payment. Just silent, anonymous help. A week after the incident with the ridge hunters, Mary Ann went back to the trading post. She half expected to find Elijah gone, moved on to wherever mountain men went when they tired of civilization. But he was there, sitting in his usual spot on the porch, working a whetstone along the edge of his knife. He looked up as she approached, and something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or acknowledgment. "Mr. Crane," Mary Ann said, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. She'd been practicing this speech in her head for days. "I wanted to thank you for the deer and the firewood. You've been very kind to my mother and me." "Just being neighborly," Elijah said, his attention returning to his knife. "We can't afford to pay you back properly," Mary Ann continued, "but my mother makes excellent pies. We thought maybe you'd accept one as a token of our gratitude." She held out the pie-apple, made with precious stores of dried fruit and sweetened with honey they'd been saving. Elijah looked at it for a long moment, then at her, and something in his expression shifted. "Haven't had pie in—" He paused, seeming to calculate. "In about 8 years." "Then you're overdue," Mary Ann said, managing a small smile. Elijah set down his knife and whetstone and stood, taking the pie from her hands with surprising delicacy. "Your mother makes this?" "We made it together," Mary Ann said. "I'm learning to cook, though I'm not as good as Mama yet." "I'm sure it's fine," Elijah said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Would you like to sit, just for a minute?" Mary Ann's heart leaped, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "I'd like that." They sat on the porch, Elijah in his chair, and Mary Ann perched carefully on the edge of a wooden crate. For a while, neither spoke. Mary Ann watched the settlement going about, its business people walking by, horses being tended, children playing in the street. It was peaceful in a way she rarely experienced, largely because Elijah's presence seemed to create a buffer zone around them. People glanced their way but kept their distance, unwilling to approach the intimidating mountain man. "You probably wonder why I helped you," Elijah said finally, breaking the silence. Mary Ann turned to look at him. "I assumed it was because you're a good man." "Not particularly," Elijah said, a bitter edge to his voice. "I've done things I'm not proud of, hurt people, killed people, spent most of my life alone because I'm better suited to it." "Then why?" Mary Ann asked softly. Elijah was quiet for so long that Mary Ann thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost inaudible. "Because I know what it's like to be laughed at when you can't fight back, to be judged for something you can't control, to have people look at you and only see what they think is wrong with you." Mary Ann's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Elijah turned to face her fully, and for the first time since they'd met, his carefully controlled expression cracked. What she saw beneath was pain, old, deep, and still raw, despite however many years had passed. "I wasn't always this big," he said. "When I was a boy, I was small, scrawny, weak. My father was a blacksmith, strong as an ox, and he couldn't understand why his son was such a runt. Neither could the other boys in our town. They made my life hell, beat me near daily, called me names, made sure I knew I was worthless." "That's terrible," Mary Ann whispered. "It is what it is," Elijah said with a shrug that tried and failed to be casual. "Eventually I grew, got strong, but by then," he trailed off, staring at his hands. "By then I'd learned that people are cruel, that society judges by appearances, that kindness is rare and usually has a price. So I left, went into the mountains, and I've been there ever since, except when I need supplies." "You've been alone all this time?" Mary Ann asked. "Alone is safer," Elijah said. "Alone means no one can hurt you, no one can judge you, no one can—" He stopped, jaw tight, and Mary Ann understood what he couldn't say. "No one can leave you." "I think," Mary Ann said carefully, "that being alone might keep you safe from hurt. But it also keeps you safe from everything good that people can offer. Friendship, companionship." She stopped, blushing furiously at what she'd almost said, but Elijah was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're wise for someone so young," he said finally. "I'm 17, Mary Ann said, lifting her chin, "and I've had plenty of time to think about loneliness." Something shifted in the air between them then, a change so subtle that Mary Ann almost missed it. But it was there, a recognition, perhaps, that they were more alike than different. Two people judged harshly by a society that had no room for those who didn't fit its narrow standards. Two souls who had learned to expect nothing from others and were therefore surprised by any small kindness. "I should go," Mary Ann said, standing reluctantly. "Mama will be wondering where I am." "Thank you for the pie," Elijah said, standing as well. "Tell your mother it's much appreciated." Mary Ann nodded and turned to leave, but she'd only taken a few steps when Elijah called after her. "Mary Ann?" She turned back. "You can come by any time," he said, "if you want to talk or just sit. Sometimes the quiet's better with two people than one." Mary Ann felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't name. "I'd like that, Mr. Crane. I'd like that very much." Over the following weeks, a tentative friendship developed between Mary Ann and Elijah. She found reasons to walk past the trading post most days, and more often than not, Elijah would be there, sitting on the porch. Sometimes they talked about the weather, about the settlement gossip, about nothing and everything. Other times, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the world go by. The people of Cedar Ridge noticed, of course. They always noticed. But where before Mary Ann would have been mocked, now she was met with wary respect. Elijah Crane's reputation as a dangerous man had only grown after the incident with the Ridge Hunters, and no one was foolish enough to insult the girl he'd defended. The Ridge Hunters themselves had made themselves scarce. They still came into town occasionally, but they gave Mary Ann and Elijah a wide berth, their earlier swagger replaced by sullen avoidance. As autumn deepened into winter, Mary Ann found herself thinking about Elijah constantly. She replayed their conversations in her mind, analyzed every word, every glance, every small smile he occasionally allowed himself. She knew she was developing feelings that went beyond simple gratitude or friendship, feelings that terrified her even as they thrilled her, because surely a man like Elijah Crane couldn't be interested in someone like her. He'd helped her because of his own painful past, because he saw a kindred spirit. But that didn't mean he wanted anything more. Men like him didn't fall in love with girls like her, except that Elijah's actions suggested otherwise. He brought meat to her cabin weekly now, always field-dressed and ready to cook. He repaired their fence when it sagged. He replaced a broken shutter on their window. Once, when Mary Ann mentioned that her mother's hands ached in the cold, he appeared 2 days later with a pair of fur-lined gloves that must have taken him hours to make. "You don't have to keep doing this," Mary Ann told him one December afternoon as they sat on the trading post porch, wrapped in blankets against the bitter wind. "We're grateful, but we don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Elijah said simply. "Then why?" Mary Ann asked, turning to face him. "Why do you help us? Why do you spend time with me? I know what people think of me. I know what I look like." Elijah was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she forced herself to hold his gaze, to not flinch from whatever truth he was about to speak. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Elijah asked finally. Mary Ann nodded, her heart hammering. "I see someone who's kind despite every reason not to be. Someone who's endured cruelty but hasn't let it make her cruel in return. Someone with gentle hands and a gentle heart." He paused. "I see someone beautiful." Mary Ann's breath caught. "You don't mean that." "I don't say things I don't mean," Elijah said firmly. "Society has one definition of beautiful. I have another. And by my definition, Mary Ann Fletcher, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met." Tears sprang to Mary Ann's eyes, not tears of sadness, but of something she'd never experienced before. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be seen as something other than her size, that she could be valued for who she was rather than what she looked like. "I care about you," Elijah continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't have much to offer. I live in a cabin in the mountains. I'm not educated or refined. I'm better with animals than people. But if you'd consider it, if you think you might want—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. This man who'd faced down 5 hunters without hesitation now looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. Mary Ann didn't think. She acted on instinct, reaching out to take his large, calloused hand in hers. "I'd consider it," she whispered. "I'd consider anything if it meant being with you." Elijah's fingers closed around hers, gentle despite their strength. "Your mother? won't approve? Mama wants me to be happy, Mary Ann said. And you make me happy, Elijah Crane. He smiled, then a real smile, the first she'd ever seen on his face. It transformed him, making him look younger, less hardened by life. Then I guess I better do this properly, he said. Mary Ann Fletcher, may I court you? Yes, Mary Ann said, laughing through her tears. Yes, you may. Their courtship was the talk of Cedar Ridge throughout that long winter. Some people whispered disapprovingly, the strange mountain man and the fat girl, they said, as if their relationship was proof of some mutual deficiency. But others, particularly those who'd witnessed Elijah's defense of Mary Ann, looked at the couple with something approaching respect. Margaret Fletcher had her reservations, but when she saw how her daughter glowed in Elijah's presence, how Mary Ann's confidence grew with each passing week, she gave her cautious blessing. You treat her right, Margaret told Elijah one evening when he came to dinner. You treat her like she deserves, or mountain man or not. You'll answer to me. Yes, ma'am, Elijah said seriously. I intend to treat her better than she deserves, because she deserves the world. By spring, Elijah had asked for Mary Ann's hand in marriage, and she'd accepted immediately. They were wed in June of 1817, in a simple ceremony at the settlement's small church. Mary Ann wore a dress her mother had made, and Elijah wore clean buckskins and had even trimmed his beard for the occasion. The Ridge Hunters didn't attend. They'd left Cedar Ridge months earlier, driven out not by force but by the cold shoulder the community had collectively given them after word spread about what they'd done to Mary Ann. Silas Gretsch had tried to reassert his authority one too many times and had found that the settlement no longer tolerated his bullying. After the wedding, Elijah took Mary Ann to his cabin in the mountains. It was a solid structure he'd built himself, nestled in a small valley with a clear stream running nearby. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with a large stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out over miles of untouched wilderness. It's perfect, Mary Ann said, taking in her new home. It's absolutely perfect. It'll need a woman's touch, Elijah said, watching her nervously. I know it's not much. It's everything, Mary Ann interrupted, turning to embrace him. It's everything because it's ours. The autumn of 1827 found Mary Ann standing on the porch of their cabin, watching her two children play in the yard below. Emma, age 8, was teaching her younger brother James, age 6, how to identify animal tracks in the soft earth. Both children had inherited their father's sturdy build and their mother's gentle disposition. Inside, Elijah was working on a new table. Their old one was too small now for their growing family. Mary Ann heard the steady rhythm of his hammer and smiled, still amazed after all these years that this life was truly hers. Their life in the mountains wasn't easy. They worked hard, hunting, trapping, maintaining their property, raising their children. But it was a good life, filled with the kind of simple joys that Mary Ann had never imagined possible during those dark days in Cedar Ridge. They went down to the settlement a few times a year for supplies and to check on Margaret, who was growing frail but remained sharp as ever. Each visit reminded Mary Ann of how far she'd come, how much had changed since that October day when Elijah had stood up for her. She'd gained weight over the years. Pregnancy and good living had seen to that. But here, in their mountain home, her size didn't matter. Elijah still looked at her with the same expression of wonder and love he'd worn on their wedding day. Their children adored her, seeing her strength and kindness rather than her appearance, and she'd finally learned to see herself through their eyes, not as the fat girl everyone mocked, but as a capable woman, a loving mother, a cherished wife. "Mama," Emma called up from the yard, "can we have stew for supper, please?" "We can indeed," Mary Ann called back, "but you two need to wash up first." As the children ran toward the stream, laughing and pushing each other playfully, Elijah emerged from the cabin and wrapped his arms around Mary Ann from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I ever thought possible," Mary Ann replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Are you?" "Every single day," Elijah said. "You know, sometimes I think about what my life would have been if I hadn't been sitting on that porch that afternoon, if I'd stayed in the mountains, avoiding people like I'd always done." "And," Mary Ann prompted. "And I think I would have survived," Elijah said slowly. "But I wouldn't have lived. Not really. You gave me that, Mary Ann. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain." Mary Ann turned in his arms to face him, her hands on his chest. "We gave that to each other," she corrected. "You taught me that I was worth defending, worth loving. That's a gift I can never repay." "No repayment needed," Elijah said, his gray eyes soft with love. "Your presence in my life is payment enough." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the Crane family gathered for supper. There was laughter at their table, warmth in their home, and love binding them all together. Years ago, Mary Ann had believed that she would spend her life alone, unloved and unvalued. Years ago, Elijah had been convinced that solitude was the only safe path. They'd both been wrong, and they'd both been saved not by grand gestures or dramatic changes, but by the simple act of one person choosing to stand up when everyone else walked away. It was a lesson they taught their children, a story they told often not to glorify violence or conflict, but to emphasize the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, of seeing value where society sees deficiency, of understanding that true strength lies not in physical power, but in the courage to be kind when cruelty is easier. And late at night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Elijah and Mary Ann would sit together on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the mountains. They didn't need many words they never had. Their love was built on understanding, on shared pain, transformed into shared joy, on the recognition that they were both better together than they'd ever been apart. Mary Ann had once been the girl everyone laughed at, the target of casual cruelty in a harsh world, but now she was a woman who'd found her strength, her purpose, and her place. She was loved, deeply and truly, by a man who saw her clearly and valued her completely. And that, she often thought, was the happiest ending any story could have.